Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that echoes across 10,000 years, and it has never once fallen silent. It is the grinding of ceramite boots upon alien soil. It is the crack of bolt shells splitting the air apart over burning cities. It is the low guttural chanting of warriors dressed in black, their voices rising through the corridors of warships that have never known a permanent harbor, never been allowed to rest at anchor in the calm waters of peace. It is the sound of a crusade, not one that began and ended within the span of a single campaign or a single lifetime, but one that has been carried forward, generation after generation, oath after oath, death after death, for longer than most civilizations have existed. And if you listen closely enough, if you press your ear to the cold metal hull of the warship called the Eternal Crusader and hold your breath against the void, you can still hear it. The first oath, the one that started everything. Welcome. Settle in, and let me take you somewhere old, somewhere drenched in faith and fury and the kind of devotion that breaks bones and forges legends. Tonight, we are talking about the Black Templars, the Sons of Dawn who took the fire of the Great Crusade into their hearts and refused, absolutely refused, to ever let it die. They are not a chapter that defends walls, though their blood comes from the greatest wall builder the galaxy has ever known. They are not a chapter that sits in fortress monasteries and waits for threats to come knocking at their gates. No, the Black Templars go out. They hunt, they seek. But they find the enemies of the Emperor wherever they fester, and they burn them out of existence with the kind of righteous violence that would make other chapters of the Adeptus Astartes pause and wonder whether perhaps these brothers have taken things a step too far. And in that hesitation, in that moment where another warrior might hold back, the Black Templars have already drawn their chainswords and closed the distance to melee range, because that is where faith is tested. Not at a distance, not behind the scope of a sniper rifle or the calculations of a tactical display. Faith is tested when you can smell your enemy's breath and feel their blade scraping along your armor, and you do not flinch, because you know, with an absolute certainty that would terrify any rational mind, that the God Emperor of mankind is watching, and he expects you to win. That is who the Black Templars are. And their story stretches all the way back to the final, desperate days of the Horus Heresy, when the walls of the Imperial Palace were cracking and the sky above Holy Terror burned with the fires of betrayal. But before we get to the founding, before we talk about crusades and keeps and the Eternal Crusader herself, we need to begin where all things in this story begin. We need to talk about a man born in the refugee camps of a shattered world. A man who would become the greatest swordsman among the legiones Astartes. A warrior so lethal and so single-minded in his purpose that even the Primarch of the Blood Angels, Sanguinius himself, once remarked that this particular son of Dawn seemed less like a champion and more like death itself, walking in borrowed armor. And his name was Sigismund. And he is the reason the Black Templars exist at all. To understand Sigismund, you have to understand the world that made him. Terror, in the age before the Emperor revealed himself and began the Unification Wars, was not the golden cradle of civilization that imperial propaganda would later pretend it had always been. It was a ruin. It was a corpse of a planet, still breathing, still twitching, but broken in ways that no amount of wishful thinking could disguise. Wars had ravaged its surface for millennia. Warlords and techno-barbarian kings carved out tiny kingdoms from the rubble and defended them with weapons that were often older than the civilizations that had built them. The air was poisoned, the water was scarce, and the people, the countless billions of souls who lived and died in the shadow of those crumbling hive spires and irradiated wastelands, were as savage and desperate as any alien species the Imperium would later encounter in the stars. Sigismund was born into this hell. The records are fragmentary, as they are for most individuals from that era. But what has survived tells us that he came from the drift camps of the Ionis Plateau, refugee settlements where the displaced and the dispossessed gathered in loose, dangerous communities that offered something just barely recognizable as survival. He was an orphan. The city where he had been born was burned during the Unification Wars, reduced to ash and memory before he was old enough to understand what had been lost. He survived because someone protected him. A girl named Thera, older than him, tougher than him, who used a metal bar to fight off gang members who preyed on the weak and the young. We do not know what happened to Thera. History did not record her fate, as history rarely records the fates of those who protect children in the ruins of fallen cities. But we know what happened to the boy she protected. He was selected, chosen from among the refugees and the orphans and the desperate, half-starved children of a dying world to undergo the process that would transform him from a fragile mortal into something far greater and far more terrible. He was inducted into the 7th Legion. He became an Imperial fist, and from the moment the gene seed of Rogel Dawn took root in his flesh, it became clear that something extraordinary had been unleashed upon the galaxy. Sigismund rose through the ranks of the Imperial fists with a speed that alarmed some and impressed all. He was not a politician. He was not a diplomat. He was not the kind of warrior who won his battles through clever maneuvering or brilliant strategy, although he was certainly capable of both when the situation demanded it. Number Sigismund was, at his core, a fighter, a pure, undiluted expression of martial perfection that bordered on the supernatural. He fought with a cold, focused intensity that made other Astartes look sloppy by comparison. And in an era where the galaxy was full of warriors who had been engineered to be the most perfect killing machines in human history, that is saying something remarkable. He earned the rank of First Captain, the highest field command beneath the Primarch himself, and served as adjutant to Rogel Dawn throughout the Great Crusade. On the dueling floors of 100 warships and the battlefields of 100 worlds, he tested himself against the finest warriors the legions Astartes had to offer, and he was never defeated, not once. The only time anyone came close was when a captain of the Night Lords, the infamous Jago Sevatarian, head-butted him in the middle of a sparring match, which was less a defeat and more a reminder that some people simply do not fight fair, and that this is a lesson worth remembering. But Sigismund's skills were not limited to the practice cage. During the Great Crusade itself, he demonstrated a pattern of behavior that would come to define everything the Black Templars would later become. He was aggressive, not recklessly so, but with a directed, purposeful ferocity that turned every engagement into a personal declaration of war against whatever unfortunate enemy happened to be standing in his path. He led from the front. He charged headlong into the thickest concentrations of enemy resistance, not because he was suicidal, but because he believed, truly and deeply believed, that this was where a warrior was supposed to be. Not directing fire from a command bunker, not studying tactical holograms and issuing orders through a Vox network. In the fight, in the blood, in the screaming, grinding heart of the engagement where steel met flesh and only one walked away. It was during the Great Crusade that Sigismund's path intersected with another warrior whose fate would become inextricably linked with his own. During a period when the Imperial Fists served alongside the 12th Legion, the World Eaters, Sigismund struck up an unlikely friendship with a warrior named Khan. Yes, that Khan, the one who would later earn the title, the Betrayer, and become one of the most feared servants of the Blood God. But in those days, before the heresy tore the galaxy in half, Khan was simply a fellow warrior, a kindred spirit who shared Sigismund's love of personal combat and the honest test of blade against blade. The two of them sparred frequently in the fighting cages aboard the World Eater's flagship, the Conqueror. These were not gentle training exercises. These were brutal, exhausting contests that left both participants battered and bleeding. And it was during these sessions that Sigismund earned a name that would follow him for the rest of his days. The Black Knight, they called him. And the title stuck because it fit him the way a scabbard fits a sword. There was something dark about him, something relentless and inevitable, like the fall of night across a battlefield. It was also from Khan that Sigismund adopted a custom that would become one of the most recognizable traditions of the Black Templars, the practice of chaining one's weapons to one's wrists. The story goes that after a particularly intense duel with the Primarch Angron himself, during which Sigismund had been disarmed and nearly killed, Khan suggested that a warrior should never be separated from his blade. Sigismund took the lesson to heart, and from that day forward, he bound his weapons to his arms with chains, ensuring that no matter what happened in the heat of combat, his sword would always be in his hand. It was a small thing, perhaps, a minor detail in the vast sweep of galactic history, but small things have a way of growing into traditions, and traditions have a way of defining chapters. There is something else worth mentioning about Sigismund during the Great Crusade, something that speaks to the duality of his character. On one hand, he was a killing machine, a warrior whose entire existence seemed to revolve around the next fight, the next challenge, the next opponent to be tested against. But on the other hand, he was a thinker, a philosopher of sorts, though he would have despised the word. He had opinions about the nature of the crusade, about the direction the Imperium was headed, and about the fundamental question of whether what they were building would last. During one memorable conversation with Captains Garviel Loken and Tarik Torgadon of the Lunar Wolves, those brave warriors who would later stand against their own legion's betrayal, Sigismund stated his belief that the Great Crusade would never truly end, that the idea of bringing the entire galaxy to heel, of exterminating every threat and unifying every human world under the banner of the Emperor, was a dream that could never be fully realized. There would always be more enemies. There would always be more darkness pressing in at the edges of the light. The crusade was not a campaign with a beginning and an end. It was a condition, a permanent state of warfare that would define humanity's existence for as long as humanity existed. Loken and Torgadon were troubled by this view. They were idealists in their way. They believed in the promise of the Great Crusade, in the possibility of a galaxy at peace, governed by reason and united by the bonds of shared humanity. Sigismund's fatalism struck them as bleak, even defeatist. But Sigismund did not see it that way. To him, the fact that the war would never end was not a cause for despair, it was a cause for purpose. If there would always be enemies, then there would always be a need for warriors. And if there would always be a need for warriors, then the warrior's life was not a temporary condition, a means to an end that would eventually become obsolete. It was the end itself, the purpose, the meaning. This philosophy would become the bedrock of the Black Templars. The idea that the crusade is eternal, that war is not something to be endured and survived, but something to be embraced as a sacred duty, that runs through every aspect of the chapter's culture. It is why they never established a homeworld. It is why they organize into crusade fleets rather than garrison companies. It is why they have been at war for 10,000 years without a single day of peace. Because Sigismund understood, before the heresy, before the betrayal, before the walls of the palace burned and the emperor was broken, that war is the natural state of the galaxy, and that the only honest response to that truth is to wage it with everything you have, forever, without apology and without the false comfort of pretending that it will someday end. He was, in retrospect, the most honest man in the entire Imperium. Let me also paint a picture of Sigismund's physical presence for you, because this matters. We often talk about space marines in the abstract, as statistics and capabilities, and we forget that these are real beings who move through the world with a physical presence that can awe or terrify. Sigismund was tall, even for an Astartes. His features were austere, carved from something harder than mere bone. His eyes held the kind of intensity that made other warriors uncomfortable, not because it was hostile, but because it was penetrating. When Sigismund looked at you, you got the distinct impression that he was measuring you. Not your worth as a person or your value as a human being, but your value as an opponent. How fast were you? How strong? Where were your weak points? How many seconds would it take him to kill you if the need arose? It was an unsettling quality, and it earned him few friends outside the dueling cage. The Primarch Sanguinius, that golden angel of the Blood Angels who was beloved by nearly everyone who ever met him, once observed Sigismund in combat and said something that has followed the first captain through the ages. Sanguinius called him less Dawn's champion and more Death's himself. It was not meant as an insult, not entirely. Sanguinius was simply articulating what everyone who watched Sigismund fight already knew on a visceral level. There was something about the way this warrior moved, something about the perfect economy of his movements, and the absolute finality of his strikes that transcended ordinary skill. He did not fight like a man who had been trained to kill. He fought like a man who had been born to kill, who was, in some fundamental way, an expression of the concept of ending things, of closing chapters, of bringing conflicts to their inevitable conclusion. This was the warrior who would found the Black Templars. This was the template from which 10,000 years of crusading fury would be cast. And then the heresy came, and everything changed. The betrayal of Horus Lupercal did not arrive as a surprise to everyone. There were whispers, there were warnings. But to most of the Imperium, the idea that the War Master himself, the Emperor's most trusted son, could turn against everything they had built together was simply unthinkable. It was like being told that the sun would rise in the west tomorrow, or that gravity had decided to take the day off. It was a fundamental violation of the way the universe was supposed to work, and even those who had harbored suspicions struggled to accept the reality of what was happening. As for the Imperial Fists, the news arrived aboard a ship called the Eisenstein, a battered Death Guard frigate that had fought its way free of the treachery at Istvan and limped into the Sol system, carrying a single, desperate survivor. Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, a loyalist who had witnessed the massacre of his own brothers and barely escaped with his life, brought word of Horus's rebellion directly to Rogel Dawn. And it was Sigismund who accompanied his Primarch to board the Eisenstein and hear Garrow's account of the horrors that had transpired. The news shattered Dawn. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists was not a man given to emotional displays, but the betrayal of Horus struck him with a force that no weapon could match. Sigismund, however, reacted differently. Where Dawn was broken by disbelief, Sigismund was hardened by certainty. He had always harbored a dark, realistic view of the galaxy's future. Years before, while talking with captains of the Lunar Wolves, Sigismund had voiced his belief that the Great Crusade would never truly end, that there would always be enemies to fight, always be darkness pressing in at the edges of the light. He had been right, and the vindication of his pessimism brought him no comfort, only purpose. Dawn dispatched Sigismund to the Istvan system to reconnoiter and lend aid if possible. But it was during this period of isolation from his legion, separated from his brothers and tormented by the implications of Horus's betrayal, that something profound happened to Sigismund. He encountered Euphrati Keeler, a civilian who had been attached to the Sons of Horus fleet to document the Great Crusade. Keeler had escaped the treachery at Istvan and, in the process, had undergone a transformation that defied rational explanation. She manifested powers that seemed to come not from the warp, but from faith itself. Pure, unwavering belief in the divinity of the Emperor of mankind. And in Sigismund's presence, she drove back demons with nothing but the strength of her conviction. This was the moment that planted the seed of everything the Black Templars would become. Sigismund, already inclined toward a cold, uncompromising view of the universe, witnessed what appeared to be a genuine miracle. He saw the power of faith made manifest in a way that even the most hardened warrior could not dismiss. And in that moment, separated from his Primarch and surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had believed about the galaxy, Sigismund became convinced of the Emperor's divinity. This was not a small thing. This was not a minor theological adjustment. In the 31st millennium, the imperial truth, the official doctrine of the Great Crusade, explicitly denied the existence of gods. The emperor himself had decreed that there were no deities, no divine powers, nothing supernatural that could not be explained through science and reason. To believe otherwise was to commit a form of heresy, and for a first captain of the imperial fists, one of the emperor's own chosen warriors, to embrace the idea that the emperor was literally a god was a transgression of the highest order. But Sigismund did not care about orthodoxy. He cared about truth. And the truth, as he had witnessed it with his own eyes, was that faith had power, real, tangible, demon-banishing power. And if that made him a heretic in the eyes of the imperial truth, then so be it. He would be a heretic who believed, and that belief would carry him through the darkest days that were yet to come. When Sigismund returned to Terra, he carried this conviction with him like a blade hidden beneath his cloak. He did not speak of it openly, not yet. There were more pressing matters to attend to. Horus was coming, and the walls of the imperial palace needed to be made ready for the greatest siege in human history. The siege of Terra. Just saying those words aloud conjures images of unimaginable destruction, of a war fought on a scale that the human mind struggles to comprehend. The entire planet of Terra, the birthworld of humanity, the seat of the Emperor's power, surrounded and besieged by the forces of the War Master and the dark gods that whispered in his ear. Millions of soldiers, human and transhuman alike, locked in a desperate struggle for the fate of the entire species. And at the center of it all, behind the massive walls of the imperial palace, stood the imperial fists and their primarch, Rogol Dawn, the architect of those very defenses. Sigismund was there. Of course he was there. He had spent his entire life training for exactly this kind of fight, and as the traitor forces closed around Terra like a fist, he stepped forward to fulfill a role that would echo through the next 10,000 years of history. Rogol Dawn chose Sigismund to be the Emperor's champion. Think about what that means. Think about the weight of that title, the burden of that responsibility. The Emperor's champion was not merely a skilled fighter. He was the designated instrument of the Emperor's own wrath, a warrior selected from among all others to stand at the forefront of the defense and challenge the enemy's mightiest champions in single combat. He was given the finest armor available, the most powerful weapons the Imperium could provide, and he was pointed at the enemy like a living weapon and told to go forth and kill. And Sigismund did exactly that. During the siege of Terra, while the walls of the palace crumbled and the sky burned with the re-entry trails of drop pods and the screaming contrails of fightercraft, Sigismund waded into the traitor ranks and challenged their champions one by one. He faced them in single combat, blade against blade, skill against skill, faith against heresy, and he killed them. As more than 24 of the enemy's most powerful leaders fell before his sword during the siege. 24 champions of chaos, warriors empowered by the dark gods themselves, warriors who had sold their souls for strength and speed and cunning beyond mortal limits, and Sigismund cut them all down. His armor was ceremonially painted black for this role, like the chaplains of the Reclusium who served the emperor directly and without intermediary. Black, the color of absolute devotion. Black, the color of a warrior who had sworn himself to something greater than any legion or any primarch. This was significant. This was a statement. Sigismund was not merely fighting for the imperial fists, he was fighting for the emperor himself. And the black of his armor announced this to everyone who witnessed him stride across the killing fields of the palace walls. During the desperate fighting, Sigismund faced enemies that would have broken lesser warriors. At the Saturnine Gate, he led the defense against the entire Emperor's Children Legion, holding the walls against wave after wave of perfumed, sensation-drunk traitors who fought with an obscene grace that made their butchery look almost artistic. During this engagement, he was attacked by Fulgrim himself, the demon primarch of the Emperor's Children. And while no mortal warrior could truly match a primarch in combat, Sigismund held his ground until Rogol Dawn himself intervened. He even managed to throw the infamous Eidolon, Fulgrim's lieutenant, from the walls of the palace. He battled Khan, his old sparring partner, but now fully consumed by the fury of the blood god. And although Sigismund was the superior swordsman, Khan was surging with the terrible power of Khorne, and the fight nearly killed the first captain, before Dawn once again saved him. That he survived encounters with a demon Primarch and one of Khorne's most favored warriors speaks volumes about the kind of fighter Sigismund was. Not just skilled, not just talented, but sustained by something deeper, something that went beyond training and genetic enhancement and sheer physical capability. He was sustained by faith. The siege ended, as all things end, though not in the way anyone had hoped. The Emperor defeated Horus aboard his flagship, but at a terrible cost. The Master of Mankind was broken, his body ruined beyond repair, and he was interred upon the Golden Throne, a life support system that was also the psychic beacon known as the Astronomicon, the light that guided Imperial ships through the madness of the warp. Rogel Dawn, who found his father's shattered body aboard the War Master's battle barge, was devastated. The Primarch who had built the walls of the palace, who had poured everything he had into defending the Emperor's home, stood in the wreckage of the War Master's throne room and looked upon the broken body of his father, and something inside him cracked. Not his resolve, not his courage, something deeper, something that would take centuries to heal, if it ever healed at all. The Iron Cage incident, that disastrous assault upon the Iron Warrior's fortified death trap that would cost the Imperial Fists thousands of casualties and force Dawn to face the limits of his own stubbornness, still lay ahead. The Pain Glove, that terrible device that the Primarch would use to punish himself for what he perceived as his failure to protect the Emperor, was already waiting in the depths of the phalanx. But in the immediate aftermath of the siege, there was a more pressing concern, one that would determine the shape of the Imperium's military for the next 10,000 years. The legions had to be broken apart. Robert Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines and the most politically savvy of the Emperor's sons, had written a document called the Codex Astartes. This was not simply a military manual. It was a constitution for the post-heresy Space Marines, a comprehensive reorganization of how the Adeptus Astartes would operate, recruit, train, and deploy. The core principle was simple and, from a certain perspective, entirely reasonable. No single individual should ever again command the kind of military force that Horus had wielded. The legions, those vast armies of tens of thousands of Astartes that had conquered the galaxy during the Great Crusade, were too dangerous to be left intact. They needed to be broken down into smaller formations called chapters, each consisting of roughly 1,000 warriors, each answerable to its own command structure, each too small on its own to threaten the Imperium the way Horus had. The logic was sound, the fear was justified, but the execution was a political minefield, because not every Primarch agreed that Guilliman's solution was the right one, and some resented being told what to do by a brother who, in their view, had not earned the authority to make such demands. Rogel Dawn did not agree. While he saw the Codex Astartes as an insult, a slap in the face directed at him and his sons by a Primarch who had not even been present for the defense of Terra. Where had Guilliman been while the walls of the palace burned? Where had his Ultramarines been while the Imperial Fists bled and died to hold the line against the traitor forces? Safe in Ultramar, that was where. Building their own little empire while the real fighting happened elsewhere. And now this armchair general, this administrator in Primarch's armor, had the audacity to tell Rogel Dawn how to organize his own warriors. The rift between Dawn and Guilliman grew so severe that it threatened to spark a second civil war. The Imperial Fists were actually fired upon by the Imperial Navy at one point. Was an unthinkable act that demonstrated just how close the Imperium came to tearing itself apart all over again. But in the end, Dawn relented. He saw what another war would cost, and he was not willing to pay that price. So the Imperial fists were broken apart, and from the body of the 7th Legion, 3 chapters were born. The Imperial fists themselves, who retained the name and the legacy of Dawn. The Crimson Fists, who took the younger warriors and a portion of the Legion's strength, and the Black Templars. Sigismund took command of the 3rd chapter. He gathered to himself the most zealous, the most aggressive, the most fervently devoted warriors the Imperial fists had to offer. These were not the patient, methodical siege specialists that defined the rest of Dawn's line. These were the firebrands, the holy warriors. The ones who looked at the galaxy and saw not a strategic puzzle to be solved, but a spiritual battleground where the forces of light and darkness clashed in an eternal struggle that would never end and could never be won. Only fought, forever, with every ounce of fury a warrior could muster. They took on the black and white colors of Sigismund's own armor. Black, because they served the Emperor directly, without intermediary, without the buffer of doctrine, or the comfort of orthodoxy. White, because purity of purpose was the only shield a warrior truly needed. And they took the cross as their symbol, a stark, angular mark that evoked the military orders of ancient terror, the knights and crusaders of a long-dead age who had marched to war under the banner of faith. The choice of colors was deliberate and deeply meaningful. Now, the black of a Black Templar's armor is the same black that Sigismund wore when he was appointed Emperor's champion during the Siege of Terror. It is the same black worn by the chaplains of the Reclusium, those warrior priests who serve the Emperor with a directness and intimacy that other officers cannot claim. To wear black in the tradition of the Adeptus Astartes is to declare oneself a direct servant of the Emperor, beholden to no other authority, bound by no loyalty other than to the divine. Every Black Templar who dons his armor is making that declaration. Every time the ceramite plates are sealed around a warrior's body and the helmet descends over his face, he is saying, "I serve the God Emperor, and I serve him alone." The white of their tabards and shoulder markings carries its own symbolism. Purity, clarity, the absolute, our undiluted conviction that what they are doing is right. There is no grey in the Black Templars' worldview. There is no moral ambiguity, no room for doubt, no space for the kind of philosophical hedging that other chapters might indulge in when faced with difficult ethical questions. There is the Emperor's light, and there is the darkness that opposes it. There is loyalty, and there is heresy. There is faith, and there is damnation. The white on their armor is a visual reminder of this binary, a declaration that the warrior who wears it has chosen his side and will never, under any circumstances, waver. The cross itself draws from the deepest wells of human history. The Black Templars are named for the Knights Templar, those medieval warrior monks who fought in the crusades of ancient terror's distant past, marching into hostile lands under the banner of their faith to reclaim holy places from those they considered enemies of their god. The resemblance is not accidental. Games Workshop, the creators of this universe, deliberately evoked that imagery when designing the Black Templars, drawing also from the Teutonic Knights and the Knights Hospitaller to create a chapter that felt like a spacefaring military religious order. The Germanic undertones in the chapter's naming conventions, the emphasis on vows and oaths, the structure of neophytes serving under initiates in a manner that mirrors squires serving under knights, all of these elements combine to create a chapter that feels genuinely medieval in its sensibilities, despite operating in a science fiction setting that is 40,000 years removed from the age of castles and crusades. Whilst it is this fusion of the ancient and the futuristic that makes the Black Templars so compelling. They are warriors from the far future who fight with the spirit of warriors from the distant past. And the result is something that resonates on a level that transcends the specific details of their setting. Promoted to the rank of High Marshal, a title unique to the Black Templars that served the same function as Chapter Master, Sigismund stood aboard the Eternal Crusader, the vast Gloriana-class battleship that would serve as the chapter's home, and he swore an oath. Not a quiet, private oath whispered into the darkness of a chapel, a thundering, public declaration that rang through the corridors of the warship and was witnessed by every warrior under his command. He swore that upon leaving Terra, he and his chapter would prove their loyalty to the Emperor by never resting in the prosecution of their duties against his enemies. Never resting, not pausing, not taking a break, not finding a comfortable world to settle down on and defend. Never resting. The crusade would not stop until every last enemy of the Emperor had been destroyed. And since there would always be enemies, the crusade would never end. This was the founding oath of the Black Templars, and every High Marshal since Sigismund has renewed that oath, binding themselves and their warriors to the same endless, impossible, magnificent purpose. For more than 10,000 years, the crusade has continued. For more than 10,000 years, the sons of Sigismund have been at war. Not intermittently, not when the mood strikes them, constantly, perpetually, without pause or respite or the luxury of peace. It is the longest continuous military campaign in the history of the Imperium of man, and it shows no signs of stopping. There is no homeworld for the Black Templars, no fortress monastery sitting upon the surface of some well-defended planet where the chapter can retreat and lick its wounds between campaigns. Instead, the Black Templars live on their ships, their battle barges and strike cruisers, and the Eternal Crusader herself serve as their monasteries, their training grounds, their homes. They drift through the void from one war zone to the next, and when they conquer a world or liberate it from whatever threat was pressing down upon it, they do not settle there. They plant a chapter keep. It's a smaller fortification that serves as a recruiting station and a staging post for future crusades, and then they move on. Always forward, always hunting, always crusading. This is what Sigismund built. Not just a chapter of Space Marines, but a philosophy made flesh. A way of war that was also a way of life, and a way of life that was also a declaration of faith. The Black Templars do not merely fight because they are ordered to. They fight because they believe, with the unshakable certainty of true zealots, that the Emperor of mankind is a god, that his enemies are the enemies of all that is holy, and that every battle, every crusade, every drop of blood shed in his name brings them closer to the divine purpose for which they were created. And Sigismund, having set all of this in motion, yet having created a chapter that would carry his vision forward through the millennia, still had one more act to perform, one more battle to fight, one more enemy to face. And it would be his last. After the second founding, Sigismund did not simply scatter his forces to the four winds and hope for the best. He was strategic in a way that many people overlook when they talk about the Black Templars, because it is easy to be distracted by the fury and the zeal and the charging headlong into melee combat of it all, and forget that underneath the religious fervor, there was a military genius at work. Sigismund analyzed the strategic situation, considered where the greatest threat to the Imperium lay, and made his decision. He brought a significant portion of the Black Templars' fleet to the Cadian Gate, the Eye of Terror, that vast, swirling wound in the fabric of reality where the warp bleeds into real space, was located in the galactic northwest, and the only reliable passage between the Eye and the rest of the galaxy was a narrow corridor of relatively stable space known as the Cadian Gate. Sigismund knew, with the same cold certainty that had defined his entire life, that the traitors who had fled into the Eye after their defeat at Terra would someday return. He said this openly and repeatedly, and almost nobody believed him. The High Lords of Terra, comfortable in their distant palaces and increasingly disconnected from the realities of the galaxy they were supposed to be governing, dismissed his warnings. The traitors were gone, they said, trapped in the Eye, unable to escape, no longer a threat. The war was over. Sigismund knew better. He had fought alongside warriors who were now traitors. He had sparred with Khan before the World Eater became a vessel for the Blood God's fury. He had faced the champions of chaos during the siege and felt the terrible power that the Dark Gods could bestow upon their servants. He knew that hatred like that did not simply burn out and die. It festered, it grew, and eventually it would explode back into real space, with a force that would make the Horus heresy look like a skirmish. So, he waited.
Honestly, I just want to pause here for a second and give you my personal take on this. Out of every single chapter in the entire 40k universe, the Black Templars are the ones that feel the most alive to me. And I think it comes down to one thing. They actually believe in something, like genuinely, fully, no hesitation, believe. Most chapters have their traditions and their honor codes and all that, but there's always this layer of pragmatism underneath, the sense that they are soldiers first and everything else second. The Black Templars flip that completely. They're believers first, and soldiering is just how the belief expresses itself. And that is what makes them so fascinating to talk about. And honestly, it's so fun to research for you guys as well. Every time I dig deeper into their lore, I find another layer that just makes me appreciate them more. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
For centuries, Sigismund maintained his vigil at the Cadian Gate. His ships patrolled the approaches to the Eye of Terror, watching for any sign of the enemy's return. He even sent vessels into the Eye itself to scout for traitor activity, a decision that required either extraordinary courage or extraordinary recklessness. And with Sigismund, while it was difficult to tell the difference, one of those scouting ships crashed on a world called Millennium, deep within the Eye, which happened to be held by the Black Legion. The enemies knew the Black Templars were watching, and the Black Templars knew the enemies were gathering. The confrontation came in 781 of the 31st millennium, roughly 500 years after the end of the Horus heresy. Ezekiel Abaddon, the former first captain of the Sons of Horus, now reborn as the War Master of Chaos and the leader of the newly christened Black Legion, emerged from the Eye of Terror at the head of a vast armada of traitors, demons, and corrupted war machines. It was the first of what would eventually be 13 Black Crusades, and it was aimed directly at the Imperium's heart. But Sigismund was there, just as he had promised, just as he had warned. The Black Templars' fleet was waiting at the Cadian Gate, and when the forces of chaos poured out of the Eye, they were met not with the confusion and panic that Abaddon had expected, but with the disciplined fury of a chapter that had been preparing for this exact moment for half a millennium. The battle was enormous. Warships collided in the void, their lance batteries trading devastating volleys of fire, while boarding torpedoes punched through hulls and disgorged screaming warriors into the corridors of enemy vessels. The Black Templars fought with the savage determination that Sigismund had bred into them, and they extracted a terrible price from the traitor forces. But the enemy was vast, and Abaddon had not returned to simply test the waters. He had come to destroy. Eventually, inevitably, Abaddon boarded the Eternal Crusader herself, the War Master of Chaos, wielding the Talon of Horus, the very weapon that had killed the Primarch Sanguinius and mortally wounded the Emperor, cut his way through the ship until he reached the chamber where Sigismund and his sword brethren were fighting. What happened next has become one of the most famous scenes in the entire history of the Imperium. Abaddon did not immediately attack. Instead, he spoke to Sigismund. He approached the High Marshal with something that witnesses described as something resembling kindness, even respect, and he made an offer, an appeal. He spoke of the Great Crusade, of the shared history between the loyalist and traitor legions, of the blood they had shed together in the name of an empire that both sides had helped to build. And he argued that the Imperium rightfully belonged to the Space Marines who had bled and died to create it, and that Sigismund should join him in reclaiming it from the corpse that sat upon the Golden Throne. Sigismund refused, not with anger, not with a dramatic speech. He simply stated the truth as he saw it. By beginning the heresy, by betraying their oaths, by nearly destroying the Imperium they claimed to love, Abaddon and his fellow traitors had proven that they did not care for the empire they had built. They were oath-breakers, nothing more, and oath-breakers deserved nothing but the blade. The duel that followed was the culmination of 10 centuries of hatred and 10 centuries of skill. Sigismund was old. Over 1,000 years had passed since his birth in the refugee camps of Terror. And while Space Marines age far more slowly than normal humans, the centuries had taken their toll. He was slower than he had been in his prime. His reactions, while still superhuman by any mortal standard, were no longer the lightning-fast responses that had made him undefeatable on the dueling floors of the Great Crusade. Abaddon, by contrast, had spent his centuries within the Eye of Terror, where the time-warping properties of the warp had preserved him at the peak of his physical condition. He was faster, stronger, and empowered by the blessings of the dark gods that he claimed to despise, but had nonetheless accepted. And yet it was close, impossibly, agonizingly close. Sigismund fought with everything he had, every ounce of skill accumulated over a millennium of warfare, every drop of faith that burned in his twin hearts. Yet he pressed Abaddon harder than the War Master had ever been pressed, drawing blood with strikes that would have killed any lesser warrior. And in the end, knowing that he could not win, knowing that the centuries had stolen what he needed to finish the job, Sigismund made a choice. He threw himself at Abaddon in a final, desperate lunge. He drove the black sword, that legendary blade of lusterless black metal that could cut through stone and steel without effort, deep into Abaddon's chest. The wound was grievous. It was the worst injury Abaddon had ever received, a scar that would remain with the War Master for the next 10,000 years, a permanent reminder of the one warrior who had come closest to ending the long war before it truly began. But the talon of Horus found its mark as well. Abaddon tore Sigismund in half, and yet, even in death, even as his body was destroyed, even as the light faded from his eyes and his two hearts pumped their last, Sigismund was not finished. With his final breath, through a mouth full of blood, speaking each word with a clarity that sent chills through every warrior present, loyalist and traitor alike, Sigismund delivered his curse upon Abaddon. You will die as your weakling father died, soulless, honorless, weeping, ashamed. Those words have echoed across 10,000 years. They have been carved into the walls of Black Templars' chapels and whispered before every battle. They are a promise and a prophecy and a declaration of war that has never been retracted. In an act of uncharacteristic chivalry, Abaddon returned Sigismund's body to the Imperium. He sent it aboard a captured vessel called the Vengeful Vow, along with the black sword, upon which was carved a formal declaration, "We are returned." It was a message, a challenge, and the beginning of the long war that would consume the galaxy for the next 10 millennia. Sigismund was gone, but the oath he had sworn lived on, and every High Marshal who followed him renewed that oath, binding the Black Templars to the eternal crusade that their founder had declared with his first breath as a chapter master and sealed with his last breath as a warrior. Let us step forward through the centuries now, past the immediate aftermath of Sigismund's death, past the mourning and the renewal of oaths and the continued prosecution of the crusade, and arrive at a conflict that would test the Black Templars in ways that even their founder might not have anticipated. We are going to the 32nd millennium, to a time when the Imperium faced a threat so massive that it made the Horus heresy look almost manageable by comparison. We are going to the War of the Beast. The enemy was not chaos this time. It was not demons or traitor Astartes or the whispering corruption of the warp. It was something far more primal, far more brutal, and in many ways far more terrifying. The Greenskins had returned, not in the scattered, disorganized raiding parties that the Imperium had grown accustomed to dealing with, but in a force so vast and so powerful that it threatened the very existence of the throne world itself. The warboss known only as the Beast had united the greenskin species in a way that had not been seen since the ancient wars of the pre-imperial era. His forces were not the crude, ramshackle armies that most imperial commanders associated with the greenskin threat. They were organized. They were disciplined. They had technology that rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, what the Imperium could field. And they had attack moons, massive space stations that could appear in orbit over a world and subject it to gravitational and psychic bombardment that drove entire populations insane before a single greenskin boot touched the surface. The Imperium was in crisis. The High Lords of Terror, those august rulers who were supposed to be guiding humanity through the darkness, were paralyzed by infighting and political maneuvering. Entire sectors fell to the greenskin onslaught. Billions died, and the Space Marine chapters that should have been the Imperium's first line of defense were scattered and disorganized, and each fighting their own isolated battles without coordination or unified command. It was during this chaos that the Last Wall Protocol was activated. The Last Wall was a contingency plan created in the aftermath of the Second Founding, a secret protocol known only to the successor chapters of the Imperial Fists. If the Imperium was ever threatened on a scale that exceeded the ability of any single chapter to respond, the successors of Dawn were to unite, setting aside their individual identities and rivalries, and fight as one. It was, in essence, a way to temporarily reconstitute the old 7th Legion without technically violating the Codex Astartes, and it had never been used before. The Black Templars answered the call. High Marshal Bohemond, who led the chapter during this period, brought his warriors to the gathering of Dawn's Sons. But the meeting was held in the Fall system, and it was a tense, fractious affair. The successor chapters had been independent for centuries, and their leaders were not accustomed to working together. Bohemond in particular was a headstrong and confrontational commander who bristled at the idea of serving under anyone's authority but his own. He was the longest-serving chapter master among the successors, and he believed that this seniority entitled him to overall command. It did not. The last surviving Imperial Fist, a captain named Corland, was chosen to lead the united force, a decision that Bohemond accepted with poor grace and worse behavior. Throughout the campaign that followed, the High Marshal was a constant source of friction, challenging Corland's decisions, objecting to his orders, and generally making himself as difficult to work with as possible. This was not the Black Templars' finest hour in terms of diplomacy, but in terms of combat, there was nothing to criticize. When the combined force of Dawn's Sons struck at the greenskin attack moon orbiting Terra, the Black Templars were at the forefront of the assault, fighting with the ferocity and determination that had become their hallmark. They deployed cyclonic torpedoes to disable the moon's surface weapons, then launched a massive landing operation, hundreds of Terminators and battle tanks touching down on the surface of the alien construct in a storm of fire and ceramite. The campaign against the Beast took the Imperium to the greenskin homeworld of Ullanor Prime, now the same planet where the Emperor had once declared Horus to be War Master, in an irony so thick you could cut it with a chainsword. There, in the capital city of Gorkogrod, the combined forces of the Imperium faced the Beast in his seat of power. The fighting was savage beyond description. The greenskin warlord was a creature of staggering power, standing over 10 meters tall and speaking perfect Imperial Gothic, a detail that disturbed the Imperial forces more than any display of brute strength could have. Even the returned Primarch Vulcan of the Salamanders could barely match the Beast, and in the end, the Lord of Drakes sacrificed himself to destroy the greenskin warlord, tackling the massive creature into the power generator of a temple gargant in a blinding explosion of energy. Bohemond witnessed the death of Corland at the hands of the Beast during the second invasion, and despite their differences, he declared his intention to launch a crusade to honor the fallen Imperial Fist's memory. The gesture revealed something important about the Black Templars, something that is easy to forget when you are dazzled by their aggression and their zealotry. Beneath all the fury, beneath the burning faith and the chain-wrapped swords and the relentless violence, there is brotherhood. There is loyalty to the bonds between warriors, a recognition that the blood of Dawn flows through all their veins, and that this shared heritage demands respect, even for those with whom you have disagreed most bitterly. Bohemond was eventually killed by Zaberin of the Fist's Exemplar, a captain who had turned renegade and allied with the Iron Warriors. The High Marshal refused to grant mercy to traitors, even those who had contributed to the war effort, and his stubbornness cost him his life. It was a fitting end for a warrior who embodied both the greatest strengths and the most frustrating weaknesses of the Black Templars' tradition. Courage and faith, and absolute refusal to bend, even when bending might have been the wiser course. But the chapter survived, as it always has. New High Marshals took the oath, new crusades were launched, and the Black Templars continued their eternal war against the enemies of the God Emperor, carrying the legacy of Sigismund forward into the dark centuries that stretched ahead. The millennia that followed the War of the Beast saw the Black Templars involved in so many conflicts, as so many crusades, so many battles fought across the breadth of the galaxy, that a complete accounting of them would fill volumes that no single human lifetime could read. But some campaigns stand out. Some moments in the chapter's history burn brighter than others, and they deserve to be remembered because they reveal the character of the Black Templars in ways that mere description cannot. The Age of Apostasy, that terrible period in the 36th millennium when the Imperium was nearly torn apart by internal corruption, saw the Black Templars at their most furious and their most righteous. The High Lord Gauge Vandir, a man whose ambition was matched only by his madness, had seized control of both the administratum and the ecclesiarchy, combining secular and religious power in a way that made him effectively the most powerful man in the Imperium. His rule was a reign of terror that saw billions killed, worlds purged, and the institutions of the Imperium twisted into instruments of personal power. High Marshal Siginandus of the Black Templars was among those who refused to accept Vandir's tyranny. When the Reign of Blood finally came to an end, brought down by the combined efforts of the ecclesiarchy's own servants and the military forces that had opposed Vandir, Siginandus was there at the siege of Vandir's palace. He fought alongside Chapter Master Lazarian of the Imperial Fists, the two warriors wielding thunderhammers as they smashed their way through the palace's defenses, was crushing all before them in a tide of righteous fury that left the walls spattered with the blood of traitors and tyrants. But when Vandir was dead, killed by his own bodyguards, the brides of the Emperor, Siginandus did not consider the matter settled. The High Marshal still burned with fury at the destruction of his chapter's keeps and the scale of the betrayal that had allowed such a monster to seize power. He set off from Terra on a personal crusade of vengeance, hunting down every man and woman who had supported Vandir's regime, every official who had enabled his tyranny, every soldier who had carried out his orders. Worlds burned in the wake of Siginandus's quest. The trail of destruction stretched across the galaxy, and it did not end until Siginandus himself died in 522M36, and his fury undiminished by the years, but his body finally giving out under the weight of centuries of relentless warfare. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the Black Templars' history. Other chapters finished their wars and went home. The Black Templars finished their wars and found new ones. The concept of home was meaningless to them. Home was the crusade. Home was the next battle. Home was wherever the enemies of the Emperor could be found and destroyed. The 37th millennium brought the Benedictine War, a conflict that demonstrated both the admirable and the terrifying aspects of the Black Templars' character in equal measure. The ecclesiarchy declared a war of faith against the alien-held worlds of the Benedictine subsector, and the Black Templars committed their entire chapter to the fight. This was not a token contribution. This was not a single crusade sent to represent the chapter, while the rest continued their operations elsewhere. Every Black Templar answered the call. They fought alongside 5 orders of the Adepta Sororitas and a vast army of the faithful, and the campaign was bloody beyond description. 2 High Marshals were killed in rapid succession during the fighting. 2. The loss of a single High Marshal was a catastrophic blow to any chapter. The loss of 2 in a short period should have been enough to break the Black Templars' morale and force a withdrawal. Instead, it only made them angrier. The new High Marshal, Constantine, ignored the ecclesiarch's declaration that the war was over and the Emperor's will had been done. He continued the crusade alone, at the Black Templars pressing forward without allied support, fighting the alien on their own terms until the entire subsector had been cleansed. This is worth pausing on because it says something profound about the Black Templars' relationship with authority. They are fanatically loyal to the Emperor. They will obey his will without question or hesitation. But they define his will according to their own interpretation, and they do not accept that any mortal authority, not the ecclesiarchy, not the High Lords of Terror, not even the Inquisition, has the right to tell them when the Emperor's work is done. If there are still enemies to fight, the crusade continues. If there are still worlds to cleanse, the crusade continues. It does not matter who says otherwise. The Black Templars answer to the Emperor, and the Emperor, as being interred upon the golden throne and unable to issue verbal orders, has not told them to stop, so they will not stop. This attitude has made them one of the most autonomous forces in the Imperium. The High Marshal of the Black Templars is answerable to no one short of the Emperor himself. He does not justify his deployment decisions before the High Lords. He does not submit his crusade plans for approval. He simply decrees where his warriors will fight, and they fight there, and if anyone has a problem with that, they are welcome to take it up with several thousand zealous space marines who have chain-wrapped swords and very strong opinions about the proper way to respond to criticism. The Gerulus Crusade, launched at some point during this long era, is notable for a different reason entirely. It was during this crusade, fought to reclaim a hive world from enemy occupation, that the Black Templars developed the design for what would become one of the most iconic vehicles in the Imperium's arsenal, the Land Raider Crusader. The standard Land Raider, that venerable workhorse of the Adeptus Astartes armored forces, was equipped with twin-linked las cannons, making it a powerful anti-armor platform, but somewhat limited in its ability to support infantry assaults. The Black Templars, who lived and breathed close-quarters combat and needed a vehicle that could punch through enemy lines and deliver a full squad of screaming, chainsword-swinging warriors directly into the heart of the enemy formation, decided this was insufficient. So they modified it. They stripped out the las cannons and replaced them with hurricane-pattern bolters, and banks of rapid-firing weapons that could shred enemy infantry at close range. They reconfigured the interior to increase the troop-carrying capacity, allowing the vehicle to transport a full Crusader squad into the thick of the fighting. And they added an assault cannon to the hull for good measure, because the Black Templars' approach to vehicle design, like their approach to everything else, was to lean aggressively into their preferred mode of warfare and not worry too much about versatility. The result was a vehicle that perfectly embodied the Black Templars' combat philosophy: close the distance, break through the enemy's defenses, and deliver the Emperor's warriors directly into melee range where faith and fury could do their work. But the Land Raider Crusader proved so effective that it was eventually adopted by other chapters, and even the Grey Knights, becoming a standard variant that has served the Adeptus Astartes for millennia. It is a small thing, in the grand scheme of galactic history, a vehicle modification, but it tells you everything you need to know about the Black Templars. They did not ask permission. They did not submit a design proposal to the Mechanicus and wait for approval. They saw a problem. They solved it with the tools and the philosophy they had at hand, and they dared anyone to tell them they were wrong. Now, to truly understand the Black Templars, it is not enough to know their history. You have to understand what they believe, because for the Black Templars, belief is not a secondary consideration, or it is not a footnote to their military doctrine or a decorative flourish on their chapter culture. It is the foundation of everything they are. Strip away the black armor, the chain-wrapped swords, the crusade fleets, and the chapter keeps, and what you are left with is faith. Pure, absolute, burning, unshakable faith in the divinity of the Emperor of mankind. This is unusual. Most Space Marine chapters do not worship the Emperor as a god. They revere him as their creator, their genetic sire, the architect of the Imperium, and the greatest being humanity has ever produced. But they stop short of outright deification. The imperial truth, that ancient doctrine from the days of the Great Crusade, may have been officially abandoned by the Greater Imperium, which now wholeheartedly embraces the imperial cult and the worship of the god Emperor. But many Astartes chapters maintain a more secular attitude. They see the Emperor as a man, an extraordinarily powerful and important man, but a man nonetheless. The Black Templars disagree, violently. For the Black Templars, the Emperor is a god, not metaphorically, not symbolically, not in a philosophical, let us discuss the nature of divinity kind of way. He is the God Emperor of mankind, the divine master of the human species, and his will is holy law. Every battle they fight is an act of worship. Every enemy they kill is an offering at his altar. Every oath they swear is a prayer. And every crusade they launch is a pilgrimage carried out with bolt shells and chainswords instead of candles and incense. This faith permeates every aspect of their chapter culture. Oh, their chaplains are not merely spiritual advisors who maintain morale and lead their brothers in meditation before battle. They are warrior priests, the most powerful voices in the chapter's hierarchy after the High Marshal himself, and their sermons are not gentle homilies about duty and sacrifice. They are fiery declarations of war against the enemies of the divine, thundering litanies of hatred that whip the assembled warriors into a state of righteous fury so intense that it borders on ecstasy. When a Black Templar's chaplain speaks, his words carry the weight of scripture, and the warriors who hear them respond with the fervor of true believers. And this faith shapes the Black Templars' attitude toward one of the most controversial aspects of their chapter identity, their relationship with psychers. Now, the Black Templars do not field librarians. They are one of the only Space Marine chapters in the Imperium that completely refuse to include battle psychers in their ranks. This is not an oversight. This is not an administrative error. This is a deliberate, principled, passionately defended decision that has its roots in the very deepest layers of their belief system. The reason, or at least the most commonly accepted reason, goes back to an event that took place during the Great Crusade. The Council of Nicaea, convened by the Emperor himself, was a gathering at which the question of whether Space Marines should be permitted to use psychic powers was debated. After hearing arguments from both sides, the Emperor issued the Edict of Nicaea, which banned the use of psychic powers by the Legiones Astartes. Librarians were to be disbanded, as psychic abilities were to be suppressed. The power of the warp was too dangerous to be wielded by warriors in the field. Now, this edict was eventually overturned. During the Horus Heresy, the necessity of fighting chaos forced the Loyalist legions to reinstate their librarians, and most chapters have maintained them ever since. But the Black Templars never did. They took the Emperor's original decree at face value, accepted it as divine commandment, and stuck with it. If the God Emperor said that psychic powers were forbidden, then psychic powers were forbidden, and no amount of practical necessity or tactical advantage was going to change that. This does not mean the Black Templars hate all psychers indiscriminately. Their position is more nuanced than that, though admittedly not by much. They hold special reverence for astropaths, the telepathic communicators who are soul-bound to the Emperor and serve as the Imperium's long-range communication network. The Black Templars see these individuals as holy disciples who have literally communed with the divine and been burned clean by his psychic fire. Similarly, they respect navigators, the mutant humans whose third eye allows them to perceive the Astronomicon and guide ships through the warp. The Astronomicon is the Emperor's own light, and those who can see it are blessed. But unsanctioned psychers, renegade witches, chaos sorcerers, these are the enemies of the divine, and the Black Templars pursue them with a ferocity that would give even an inquisitor pause. The motto, "Abhor the witch, destroy the witch," is not a suggestion in the Black Templars chapter. It is an article of faith, and those who violate it can expect to be treated with the same hostility that the chapter reserves for the enemies of humanity. This attitude has consequences. Without librarians, the Black Templars lack the psychic defenses that most other chapters rely upon. They cannot project psychic shields. They cannot use divination to predict the enemy's movements, and they cannot fight fire with fire when they encounter chaos sorcerers on the battlefield. This makes them vulnerable in ways that other chapters are not, and it has led to situations where the Black Templars have suffered losses that could have been avoided if they had been willing to compromise on their principles. But compromise is not in the Black Templars' vocabulary. They fill the gap left by the absence of librarians with faith, as their chaplains intone litanies and prayers that serve, in the chapter's belief, as a form of spiritual armor against the powers of the warp. Whether these prayers actually provide mystical protection or merely bolster the warrior's resolve to the point where psychic attacks become less effective is a question that theologians and tacticians have debated for millennia. The Black Templars do not care about the debate. They only care about results, and the results speak for themselves. 10,000 years of unbroken crusading, and the chapter has never fallen to chaos. Not once. Not a single Black Templar has turned traitor. Draw your own conclusions. Beyond their faith and their stance on psychers, the Black Templars maintain a chapter organization that is radically different from most Codex-compliant chapters. And understanding this structure is essential to understanding how they wage war. Most Space Marine chapters are organized into 10 companies of roughly 100 warriors each, for a total of approximately 1,000 battle brothers. This is the standard laid down by the Codex Astartes, and while many chapters deviate from it in various ways, the basic structure remains broadly consistent across the Adeptus Astartes. The Black Templars threw the Codex Astartes into the nearest airlock. Their chapter is organized not into companies, but into crusades. Each crusade is a semi-autonomous military force led by a marshal that operates independently of the others. The crusades vary enormously in size. Some consist of only a handful of warriors, small enough to be carried aboard a single strike cruiser. Others number in the hundreds or even thousands. Vast armadas of warships and warriors that can project the chapter's power across entire sectors. At the top of this structure sits the High Marshal, the chapter's supreme commander. The High Marshal is the only individual who knows the true number of Black Templars currently active in the galaxy, a piece of information that the chapter guards with almost paranoid secrecy. There is a very good reason for this. The Black Templars are not a chapter of 1,000 warriors. They are far, far larger than that. Estimates vary, but most credible assessments place their numbers somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 active battle brothers, with some more generous estimates going even higher. This makes them one of the largest, if not the single largest, as loyalist Space Marine chapter in existence. This is technically a violation of the Codex Astartes, which limits chapters to 1,000 warriors specifically to prevent the kind of military concentration that enabled the Horus Heresy. The Inquisition is aware that the Black Templars are larger than they should be, and they have made several attempts to determine the chapter's exact strength. They have never succeeded, partly because the chapter's crusade fleets are scattered across the galaxy and constantly in motion, and partly because the Black Templars are not particularly inclined to cooperate with inquisitorial investigations into their internal affairs. The chapter's history of fanatical loyalty to the Emperor, combined with the practical impossibility of actually counting a fleet-based chapter that spans the entire galaxy, has so far shielded the Black Templars from any serious consequences. But the Inquisition is patient, and the chapter keeps a wary eye on those who would pry into secrets that are not theirs to know. Below the High Marshal and the Marshals, the chain of command includes Castellans, who serve as second-in-command to the Marshals and lead individual fighting companies within a crusade. These fighting companies are the basic tactical units of the Black Templars, and they are organized in a way that reflects the chapter's emphasis on personal bonds between warriors. The rank-and-file battle brothers of the Black Templars are called initiates. These are fully fledged Space Marines, veterans of the chapter's genetic modification process and the grueling training that follows it, and they form the backbone of every crusade force. Unlike in other chapters, where warriors are assigned to squads based on their specialization and experience, Black Templars initiates fight alongside the brothers they know best, forming and disbanding squads on an ad hoc basis, based on familiarity and friendship rather than any imposed organizational chart. But the truly distinctive feature of the Black Templars structure is the relationship between initiates and neophytes. In most Space Marine chapters, new recruits are gathered into a scout company, the 10th Company, where they undergo the final stages of their training under the supervision of experienced scout sergeants. The Black Templars do it differently. Each neophyte, upon being deemed ready by the Castellan of the chapter keep, where he was recruited, is assigned to a specific initiate who serves as his personal mentor. This is a one-on-one relationship that mirrors the medieval tradition of squires serving under knights. The initiate swears an oath to prepare his neophyte for full membership in the chapter, to teach him its history, to guide him through its rituals, and to forge him into a warrior worthy of the Black Templars' legacy. In return, the neophyte swears obedience to his master and vows never to bring dishonor upon his name. They fight together, train together, and live together, the neophyte serving as a combination of apprentice, servant, and battle companion, until such time as the initiate judges him ready for full elevation. This system has no equivalent in any other chapter. It creates bonds between warriors that go far deeper than the standard squad cohesion found elsewhere in the Adeptus Astartes. And it ensures that every Black Templar has been personally mentored by a veteran who has passed on not just tactical knowledge and combat skills, but the chapter's faith, its traditions, and its uncompromising dedication to the Emperor's service. This bond between initiate and neophyte is not merely a military arrangement. It is sacred. The initiate swears before the Emperor and the chapter's chaplains that he will prepare his neophyte for the Brotherhood, that he will teach the young warrior the chapter's history in its entirety, that he will guide him through the ancient rites of worship, and that he will forge him into a living weapon worthy of Sigismund's legacy. The neophyte, in turn, pledges absolute obedience to his mentor and vows that he will never bring dishonor to the initiate's name. If the neophyte fails, the shame falls upon the initiate. If the neophyte succeeds, the glory is shared. It is a system designed to produce not just competent fighters, but warriors who are deeply invested in each other's success, bound together by personal loyalty as much as by shared purpose. The neophytes themselves fight alongside their initiates in what are known as Crusader squads, the standard tactical formation of the Black Templars. These squads are the backbone of every crusade force, typically consisting of a mix of 5 to 10 initiates and an equal number of neophytes, often led by a sword brother whose experience and authority keep the formation tight under the pressure of combat. The neophytes begin their service in lighter armor, carrying bolt pistols and chainsaws or shotguns, and as they prove themselves through battle after battle, they earn the right to bear the full panoply of a Black Templar's initiate, including the sacred power armor that marks them as full brothers of the chapter. And the path to becoming a neophyte in the first place is itself a trial that would break most mortal men. The Black Templars do not recruit from a single homeworld because they have no homeworld. Instead, they recruit from the worlds where they establish chapter keeps, those smaller fortifications they plant upon conquered or liberated planets. When a chapter keep is established on a world, word spreads through the local population that the God Emperor's finest warriors are accepting supplicants, and the people come. They are called expectanten, these aspiring warriors, and their journey to the chapter keep is itself a test of worthiness. The keeps are deliberately located in the most hostile terrain available, in frozen wastelands or volcanic mountain ranges or irradiated deserts, places where simply reaching the front door is an accomplishment that requires courage, resourcefulness, and physical endurance beyond what most humans possess. Many expectanten die on the journey. Those who arrive are subjected to a grueling series of trials that test their strength, their will, their martial aptitude, and their faith. Only the very best, the ones who demonstrate not just physical capability, but the spiritual fire that the Black Templars value above all other qualities, are selected for genetic modification and initiated into the chapter's ranks as neophytes. Even those who fail to be chosen benefit from the attempt. The many expectanten who are turned away from the chapter keeps go on to serve in the Imperial Guard or the Planetary Defense Forces, their bodies and minds hardened by the trials they endured. In this way, the Black Templars' recruiting process strengthens the Imperium's military even when it does not directly produce new Space Marines, a side effect that the chapter neither intends nor particularly cares about, but which has been noted by Imperial strategists as one of the unsung contributions of the Eternal Crusade. When a warrior demonstrates exceptional skill and courage in battle, he may be elevated to the rank of Sword Brethren. These are the chapter's veterans, elite warriors who form the Marshal's personal household and are trusted with the most dangerous and most important missions. These Sword Brethren are the only Black Templars permitted to wear Terminator armor, and they fulfill a role comparable to the first company of other chapters, though without the formal organizational structure that most first companies maintain. And then there is the Emperor's Champion. On the eve of battle, the Black Templars spend their time in meditation and prayer, preparing themselves for the bloodshed to come. It is during this vigil that something extraordinary sometimes occurs. One warrior among the assembled brothers will experience a vision, not a hallucination, not a dream, a vision, clear and unmistakable, in which the Emperor himself appears and guides the warrior toward his destiny. The chosen Marine, trembling with the weight of divine revelation, presents himself to the company chaplain, who hears his confession and anoints him as the Emperor's champion. The Emperor's champion is given the finest weapons and armor the chapter possesses. The black sword, a blade of lusterless black metal that can cut through stone and steel without effort, is placed in his hands. The armor of faith, a masterwork of the artificer's art, inscribed with protective prayers and sacred seals, is fitted to his body. And before the assembled warriors, the champion leads the chapter in renewing one of its sacred vows. There are 4 traditional vows, each one focusing the chapter's fury on a different aspect of their holy purpose. Suffer not the unclean to live. Uphold the honor of the Emperor. Abhor the witch. Destroy the witch. Accept any challenge, no matter the odds. The specific vow chosen by the champion sets the tone for the battle to come, and the warriors who hear it respond with a fervor that transcends normal combat motivation. In battle, the Emperor's champion has one duty: to seek out and destroy the enemy's leaders. He strides through the press of combat, guided by visions that burn like golden fire in his sight, brushing aside lesser opponents as he closes on his target. When he finds the enemy commander, he challenges them to single combat, just as Sigismund once challenged the champions of chaos during the Siege of Terror. He does not retreat. He does not waver. He fights until the enemy is dead, or he is, because his duty does not end until the black sword is pried from his cold, dead hands. If the champion falls, it is considered a dark omen, and the chaplains will bear his body from the field with solemn ceremony. But his name and deeds are recorded and remembered forever, inscribed upon the blade of the black sword itself, taking its place alongside the names of all the champions who came before. The ritual is a direct continuation of Sigismund's legacy, a living link to the founder who first bore the title of Emperor's Champion during the darkest hours of the Siege of Terror. Let me take you now to a place of fire and ash, a world where the sky burned orange and the ground shook with the footsteps of greenskin war machines the size of buildings. A place where 100 Black Templars held the line against an enemy that numbered in the millions, and where a single chaplain became a legend whose name would be whispered with reverence for centuries after the last bolt shell was fired and the last chainsword was silenced. We are going to Armageddon, and we are going to talk about Grimaldus. The Third War for Armageddon was one of the largest and most brutal conflicts of the 41st millennium. It began in 998 M41, when the greenskin warlord Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka launched a massive invasion of the strategic hive world, bringing with him the largest greenskin fighting force assembled since the ancient War of the Beast. The Imperium responded with everything it had: regiments of the Astra Militarum, squadrons of Imperial Navy warships, Titan legions, Sisters of Battle, and multiple chapters of Space Marines converged on Armageddon in a desperate attempt to hold the world against the Green Tide. Among those chapters were the Black Templars. High Marshal Helbrecht, the current leader of the chapter, was appointed commander of the combined Space Marine fleet that supported Battlefleet Armageddon in the Void War above the planet. 3 Black Templars crusades were dispatched to the surface, each deployed to a different theater of operations. And one of those crusades 100 warriors strong, was placed under the command of a newly promoted reclusiarch named Merrick Grimaldus. Grimaldus was young, even by Black Templars standards. He had been noted by High Marshal Helbrecht himself as the youngest Marine in the chapter's history to be raised to the rank of Sword Brother, as an honor that spoke of exceptional combat skill and spiritual devotion. He had been mentored by Mordred, the previous reclusiarch, and had taken his vows before the broken sword of dawn aboard the Eternal Crusader. His faith was iron, his dedication was absolute, and his first command as reclusiarch was to defend Hive Hellsreach against a force that outnumbered his own by a factor of tens of thousands to 1. The assignment itself was the subject of debate within the Black Templars' inner circle. Some of the chapter's senior officers did not fully support Grimaldus, viewing him as too young, too untested in the role of reclusiarch, to be entrusted with a command of such importance. Helbrecht himself was aware of these doubts, and there are those who have speculated about whether the High Marshal's decision to send Grimaldus to Hellsreach was a test, a trial by fire designed to either forge the young reclusiarch into the leader the chapter needed, or to find him wanting and let the fires of war decide his fate. If it was a test, Grimaldus passed it in a way that silenced every critic and humbled every doubter. Hive Hellsreach was a vast industrial city, one of Armageddon's most important centers of fuel production, with dockyards and manufacturing facilities that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. It had stood since the earliest days of the planet's colonization, and its population numbered in the millions. When the Greenskins came, they came not just from the land, but from the sea. Hundreds of tanker-sized submersibles, inbuilt by the notoriously cunning greenskin engineer known as Archimedes, rose from the polluted southern waters and made landings at the Hive's dockyards, achieving total surprise and threatening to overwhelm the defenders before they could organize a coherent response. Grimaldus and his 100 Black Templars, supported by regiments of the Armageddon Steel Legion, 19 Titans of the Legio Invigilata, and 97 battle sisters of the Order of the Argent Shroud, fought a running battle that lasted for months. The fighting was relentless. The Greenskins attacked in waves that seemed to have no end, their crude weapons and savage ferocity testing the defenders at every turn. Along the defensive corridor known as Hell's Highway, the enemy broke through again and again, each breach requiring desperate counterattacks to seal before the Hive's interior could be overrun. Through it all, Grimaldus was a presence on the front lines that inspired awe in friend and terror in foe. He was not merely a commander directing the battle from a safe distance. He was in the thick of it, his Crozius Arcanum smashing greenskin skulls, his voice rising above the din of battle with litanies that made the defenders' blood burn with renewed fury. He was everywhere he needed to be, rallying wavering defenders, leading countercharges into breached sections of the line, and demonstrating by personal example that the Emperor's warriors did not know the meaning of retreat. Multiple people who encountered Grimaldus during the campaign made the same observation. Despite the skull-faced helmet that marked him as a chaplain, despite the terrifying aspect of a warrior who had personally killed more greenskins than most soldiers would see in a lifetime, he had kind eyes. It was a detail that seemed almost absurd in context, yet it revealed something about the man beneath the armor. Grimaldus was not a monster. He was a warrior priest whose ferocity was fueled not by hatred alone, but by a genuine love for the people and the faith he was sworn to protect. The climax of the Hellsreach campaign came at the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, a vast basilica that had stood since the earliest days of Armageddon's colonization and served as the spiritual heart of the entire Hive. When the Greenskins launched their final, overwhelming assault on the temple, the defenders held for nearly 60 days, fighting from room to room, corridor to corridor, turning every doorway and every staircase into a killing ground. But the enemy was too numerous. The Astra Militarum units and the Hive militia were eventually forced to withdraw, falling back before the green tide as the temple's defenses crumbled one by one. The Black Templars refused to yield. They stood in the ruins of the temple and fought with a desperation that went beyond courage, beyond duty, beyond anything that could be explained by training or discipline alone. It was faith, pure and raw and terrible, that held them in place. And it was during this final stand that Grimaldus made the declaration that would become his most famous utterance. Standing in the wreckage of the temple, surrounded by the dead and dying, facing a horde that filled every corridor and every chamber as far as the eye could see, he planted his feet and bellowed words that would echo through the centuries. "I have dug my grave in this place, and I will either triumph or I will die." The battle ended when the entire temple collapsed. The structure, already weakened by months of fighting and the massive greenskin assault, simply could not withstand any more punishment. It came down in a thunderous avalanche of stone and metal, burying everything within it, Black Templars and greenskins alike, under millions of tons of rubble. Everyone assumed Grimaldus was dead. How could he not be? The temple had collapsed on top of him. No one could survive that. The chapter mourned. The defenders of Hellsreach mourned, and the war went on. Then, a day later, Grimaldus crawled out of the rubble. But he emerged from the ruins of the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, carrying the last sacred relics that had been housed within its walls. The apothecaries who treated his wounds afterwards said it was a miracle that he was still alive, let alone that he had the strength to dig himself free and carry the relics to safety. The people of Hellsreach agreed. They gave him the title Hero of Hellsreach, the greatest honor the Hive's inhabitants could bestow. And in the years that followed, an actual cult formed around his memory, with the citizens of the Hive lighting pyres and performing rituals at the ruins of the temple in his name. Some of those rituals were disturbing in their intensity. The cult would gather at the ruins and burn alive citizens accused of witchery, mutation, or heretical thought, as a practice that the Inquisition watched with wary interest. Others dug ceremonial graves and covered them with shrouds of industrial tarpaulin, believing that just as Grimaldus had once dug his grave in the temple's grounds and risen from it, he might emerge from these ritual pits to defend the people of Hellsreach again. It was a strange kind of veneration for a warrior who was still very much alive and fighting elsewhere in the galaxy, but it spoke to the impact that Grimaldus had made. He had not merely defended a city, he had become a symbol, a living proof that faith could hold the line when nothing else could. The broader campaign on Armageddon was equally dramatic. High Marshal Helbrecht, directing the Void War from the bridge of the Eternal Crusader, orchestrated the naval defense of the Armageddon system with the same combination of aggression and tactical acumen that defined the Black Templars' approach to every conflict. The Greenskin fleet was vast, an armada of crude but devastatingly effective warships that descended on the system in numbers that strained credulity. Helbrecht met them head-on, his fleet engaging the enemy in a series of brutal void engagements that featured the kind of close-range brawling that the Black Templars favored in every arena of warfare. The war was not confined to a single front. 3 separate Black Templars crusades operated on Armageddon's surface, each fighting in a different theater of operations, each carrying the chapter's banner into some of the most ferocious fighting of the 41st millennium. The Greenskins were relentless, but their numbers seemed limitless. For every one that fell, 3 more surged forward to take their place, driven by a savage momentum that was as much a force of nature as it was a military strategy. And yet, the Black Templars did not break. They did not waver. They fought with the same burning fury that had defined their chapter since the day Sigismund swore his oath. And when the fighting finally ground to a halt, as Armageddon's season of fire rendered further combat impossible, the Black Templars were still standing, battered, bloodied, reduced in number, but standing. Grimaldus survived. The chapter survived. And when Armageddon's season of fire came, bringing with it the volcanic storms that made further fighting impossible, the Greenskin forces were forced to withdraw. The war was not over, not truly, but Hive Hellsreach had held. And the name of Merrick Grimaldus had been written in fire and blood into the annals of the Black Templars. alongside Sigismund himself. In the aftermath of Armageddon, High Marshal Helbrecht swore a mighty oath to hunt down and slay Ghazghul Thraka before the greenskin warlord could threaten the Imperium again. The High Marshal took his remaining Crusade forces and pursued the fleeing greenskin fleet into the depths of space, accompanied by the legendary Commissar Yarrick, who had personally petitioned to join the hunt. Grimaldus, meanwhile, remained on Armageddon, turning his attention to the defense of the Celestial Lions, a fellow Space Marine chapter that had been nearly destroyed during the war and whose survival depended on the aid of brothers from other chapters. It was an act of compassion and brotherhood that demonstrated once again that the Black Templars' fury was matched by their loyalty to the bonds between warriors. But the galaxy is not kind to those who seek rest, and the Black Templars were not done being tested, not by a long measure. The 13th Black Crusade came in 999 M41, and it was everything Sigismund had warned about 10,000 years earlier, writ larger and more terrible than even the most pessimistic prophet could have imagined. Abaddon, the Despoiler, the same warrior who had killed Sigismund aboard the Eternal Crusader during the First Black Crusade, launched the largest mobilization of Chaos forces since the Horus Heresy itself. His goal was nothing less than the destruction of Cadia, the fortress world that guarded the Cadian Gate, and the opening of a path directly to Terra. But the Black Templars were there. Of course they were there. Marshal Marius Amalrich led the Cruxis Crusade to Cadia, where his warriors fought with the zeal and fury for which they were rightfully famed. The fighting was apocalyptic. The defenders of Cadia, a coalition of Astra Militarum regiments, Space Marine chapters, Sisters of Battle, and Night Houses, faced wave after wave of traitor forces, each more devastating than the last. And they lost. Cadia fell. Abaddon, unable to break the defenders through conventional means, hurled the wreckage of a Blackstone fortress from orbit into the planet's surface. The impact shattered the Cadian pylons, ancient alien constructs that had held the Eye of Terror in check for millions of years, and the Eye began to expand without limit. The resulting cataclysm tore a wound across the entire galaxy, a massive rift in the fabric of reality that came to be known as the Great Rift. It split the Imperium in two, cutting off half of humanity's worlds from the light of the Astronomicon and plunging them into a nightmare of warp storms and demonic incursions. Cadia's fall was a disaster of incalculable proportions. But from the ashes of that defeat, a desperate journey began. Marshal Amalrich, elevated to the position of Emperor's champion through a battlefield vision, joined forces with the Archmagos Belisarius Cawl and the living Saint Celestine on a mission to reach the realm of the Ultramarines and resurrect the Primarch Robut Guilliman. It was a journey fraught with danger, hunted at every step by the forces of the Black Legion, and it cost Amalrich his life. The Emperor's champion gave everything he had, fighting a rearguard action against the traitors while Cawl and Celestine pressed forward with the technology that would bring Guilliman back from the edge of death. Amalrich's sacrifice was not in vain. Guilliman was resurrected. The Primarch of the Ultramarines returned to life after 10,000 years, took command of the Imperium, and launched the Indomitus Crusade, the largest military campaign since the Great Crusade itself, aimed at stabilizing the shattered realm of humanity and pushing back the darkness that threatened to swallow everything. The opening of the Great Rift was a catastrophe that affected every faction and every force in the galaxy, and the Black Templars were no exception. Their crusade fleets, scattered across the breadth of the Imperium, had suddenly found themselves cut off from each other by storms of psychic energy and demonic incursions that made warp travel almost impossible. Several crusades vanished entirely, swallowed by the madness that poured through the wound in reality. Those that survived found themselves isolated, fighting alone against enemies that seemed to multiply with every passing day. But here is where the Black Templars' character truly shone, where other chapters might have consolidated, might have pulled back to defensible positions and waited for the storms to clear and the situation to stabilize. The Black Templars did the opposite. they attacked. When the Astronomicon flickered back to life after the period of darkness known as the Noctis Aeterna, the Black Templars did not use the reprieve to rest and recuperate, and they launched a vicious purge against the wave of mutation and heresy that had sprung up across the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift. New crusades were declared. New chapter keeps were raised on worlds that had been liberated from the grip of chaos. And the Eternal Crusade continued, unbroken, unbowed, exactly as Sigismund had intended. This was, in many ways, the Black Templars' finest hour, in a galaxy that was falling apart, in an Imperium that was fracturing along every possible line of stress. They were the one constant, the one force that did not waver, did not hesitate, did not waste a single moment on doubt or indecision. They were the sword that the Emperor had forged in the fires of the heresy, and they were still sharp after 10,000 years of use. And it was during this new era that the Black Templars faced perhaps their most unexpected challenge. Not an enemy on the battlefield, but a gift from an ally. Guilliman, in his wisdom and his pragmatism, had commissioned the creation of the Primaris Space Marines, a new breed of Astartes that were larger, stronger, and more resilient than their predecessors. These new warriors were intended to reinforce the depleted chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, and Guilliman sent torchbearer fleets across the galaxy to deliver them. Many observers expected the Black Templars to reject the Primaris. The chapter's reputation for zealotry, their deep suspicion of anything that smelled of innovation, and their general hostility toward anyone who presumed to tell them what to do, all suggested that the Primaris Marines would receive a very cold welcome aboard the Eternal Crusader. The possibility of open conflict was real enough that Guilliman himself made the journey to meet with High Marshal Helbrecht, a meeting that had the potential to be either a diplomatic triumph or a catastrophic disaster. It turned out to be neither, or rather, it turned out to be both, in ways that no one had anticipated. Helbrecht was in the middle of his pursuit of Gazkul Thraka when Guilliman arrived, and the High Marshal was not pleased at being interrupted for what he considered a diplomatic formality. He had an oath to fulfill, a greenskin warlord to kill, and the fact that a Primarch had come calling did not change his priorities one bit. Oh, but when the two warriors actually sat down to talk, something unexpected happened. Helbrecht was surprised to find that Guilliman was not the commanding despot he had expected, and Guilliman was surprised to find that Helbrecht was not the mindless fanatic that the Black Templars' reputation suggested. The Primarch made his case clearly and directly. The Imperium was in crisis. Every chapter needed reinforcement. The Primaris Marines were a gift, not an imposition, and Helbrecht was free to accept or reject them as he saw fit. But Guilliman also reminded the High Marshal that his responsibility extended beyond his personal vendetta with the Greenskins. He was the leader of one of the largest and most powerful chapters in the Imperium, and that power came with obligations that transcended individual oaths. Helbrecht accepted the Primaris. Sure, he recognized their value, promoted a number of his own sword brethren to the rank of Marshal to command new crusades composed of the new warriors, and his acceptance helped convince the various other Black Templars, crusade fleets scattered across the galaxy, to incorporate the Primaris into their own ranks. The integration was not entirely smooth. There was one particularly infamous incident involving the Angevin Crusade, where a Castellan rejected the Primaris Marines, declared them impure creations of Caul, and even turned against the Custodes escort that accompanied them. The situation escalated to the point of open violence before it was eventually resolved, but it demonstrated that the Black Templars' zealotry, while usually directed at the enemies of the Emperor, could sometimes be turned inward with dangerous results. The offending Castellan and his followers were eventually dealt with, and an investigation ordered by Guilliman himself determined that all the guilty parties were dead, allowing the matter to be quietly buried for the sake of unity. But the chapter adapted, as it always has. And there has been talk, whispered among the warrior priests and the tech adepts who oversee the process, that Black Templars seem to be especially resilient when crossing the Rubicon Primaris, the dangerous surgical procedure that transforms a standard Astartes into a Primaris Marine. Whether this is a reward for their faith in the Emperor, a quirk of Dawn's gene seed, or simply a statistical anomaly remains to be seen. The Black Templars, characteristically, attribute it to the Emperor's blessing and leave it at that. Oh, let me speak now about how the Black Templars actually fight, because the manner in which they wage war is as distinctive as their beliefs and their organization. It is not enough to say that they prefer close combat. That is like saying that a forest fire prefers to burn wood. It is technically true, but it does not convey the ferocity, the totality, the sheer overwhelming violence of the thing itself. When a Black Templar's crusade makes war, it begins from orbit. The fleet establishes dominance over the system's void space, engaging enemy warships and orbital defenses with the same aggressive posture that defines every aspect of the chapter's culture. Black Templars' warships do not fight at long range if they can help it. They close the distance, use their superior armor and the skill of their crews to absorb incoming fire, and engage the enemy at ranges where their own weapons can do maximum damage. Boarding actions are a specialty. The chapter's warriors are masters of ship-to-ship combat, and more than one enemy fleet has been broken not by lance batteries and torpedo volleys, but by the terrifying experience of having ceramite-armored zealots come crashing through the hull and proceeding to cleanse the ship deck by deck. Once orbital superiority is established, the ground war begins. The Black Templars favor two primary tactics. The first is orbital assault, a mass landing using drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships in the wake of a devastating orbital bombardment that softens the enemy's defenses and disrupts their command structure. The drop pods come down in screaming torrents, punching through atmosphere and slamming into the surface with impacts that shake the ground for kilometers in every direction. The Thunderhawks follow, their weapons blazing, carrying reinforcements and heavy equipment to support the initial wave. The second tactic, used when resistance proves too strong for a purely airborne assault, is the armored spearhead. The chapter lands its heavy armor, including its beloved Land Raider Crusaders, and drives a wedge of steel and fire through the weakest point in the enemy's defensive line. The Land Raiders crash through barricades and fortifications, their hurricane bolters shredding any infantry foolish enough to stand in their path. And when the vehicles grind to a halt or find themselves unable to advance further, the rear ramps drop open and Crusader squads pour out like water from a burst dam, chainswords revving and bolt pistols barking, crashing into the stunned defenders with the force of a wave breaking against a shore. This is the moment the Black Templars live for, the charge, the collision, the instant when disciplined range-finding and tactical calculation give way to the primal, screaming, blood-soaked reality of hand-to-hand combat. The Black Templars' righteous anger makes them impulsive and headstrong in these moments, their hatred of the enemy overriding caution and prudence in favor of raw, unstoppable aggression. Squads that have taken casualties are subject to a kind of holy rage that drives them to even greater ferocity, the loss of their brothers fueling their fury rather than breaking their spirit. This is not a subtle approach to warfare. It is not elegant. It is not the kind of carefully calibrated, multi-layered tactical methodology that would earn approving nods from the strategists of the Ultramarines or the analytical minds of the Iron Hands. But it is devastatingly effective. The Black Templars have been fighting this way for 10,000 years, and in all that time, they have never lost a crusade that they were not willing to restart at a later date with more warriors and bigger guns. There is also the matter of how the Black Templars prepare for battle, because this is where the chapter's religious character is most vividly expressed. Before every engagement, the entire crusade force gathers for a ceremony known as the oath-taking. This is not a perfunctory ritual. This is a deeply personal, a deeply emotional expression of faith that transforms the assembled warriors from individual soldiers into a unified instrument of divine wrath. The chaplains lead the ceremony. They stand before the assembled warriors and intone the litanies of the chapter, their amplified voices filling the ship's cathedral-like interior spaces with words that have been spoken before every Black Templar's battle for 10,000 years. The warriors respond in unison, their deep voices creating a wall of sound that vibrates through the deck plates and makes the air itself tremble. They swear oaths, not generic, institutional oaths of the kind that most military organizations require. Personal oaths, specific oaths, oaths to avenge a fallen brother, oaths to destroy a particular enemy, oaths to cleanse a specific world or reclaim a specific relic. These oaths are written on parchment scrolls and affixed to the warrior's armor with wax seals, so that they carry their promises into battle as a physical reminder of what they have sworn to accomplish. The effect of this ritual on the warrior's combat performance is difficult to overstate. By the time the oath-taking is complete, the Black Templars are not merely motivated. They are transcendent. They have moved beyond ordinary martial determination into a state of spiritual fury that makes them, warrior for warrior, some of the most dangerous melee combatants in the entire Adeptus Astartes. Their hatred is not blind. It is focused, concentrated, aimed at specific enemies for specific reasons, and fueled by a faith so intense that it borders on the psychic. Though the Black Templars would be deeply offended if anyone suggested such a thing. Let me also speak briefly about Helbrecht himself, because the current High Marshal is a figure who deserves more attention than he often receives. He rose to the rank of High Marshal after his predecessor, Cordhel, was killed by a champion of chaos. Helbrecht's early career was marked by the same combination of tactical brilliance and religious fervor that has characterized every great Black Templar's leader. But it was his actions during the Third War for Armageddon that cemented his reputation as one of the chapter's finest commanders. What many people do not know about Helbrecht is that he suffered a personal defeat early in his tenure as High Marshal, a loss significant enough that he undertook a 5-year crusade of penitence to atone for it. At the end of that period of self-imposed exile, he made a pilgrimage to the Imperial Fist's mobile fortress monastery, the Phalanx, where he prayed at the Hand of Dawn, a holy relic that contains the actual severed hand of the Primarch Rogel Dawn. During this pilgrimage, Helbrecht came to a realization that transformed him. He had lost his own hand in battle, and as he knelt before the relic, he understood that this loss was not a mark of failure, but a symbol of his Primarch's sacrifice. It was a sign from the Emperor, a message that suffering was not weakness, but a pathway to deeper faith and greater purpose. Helbrecht returned from that pilgrimage with the fires of faith burning inside him more intensely than ever before. He led the chapter to Armageddon, commanded the Void War against the Greenskin fleet. And when the fighting was done, and Ghazghkull Thraka fled the system, Helbrecht swore his oath of vengeance and took the crusade into the stars. He has been hunting the Greenskin warlord ever since. Not because he was ordered to. Not because some strategic assessment determined that Ghazghkull was the highest priority threat. Because he swore an oath. And Black Templars do not break their oaths. The skull of the navigator that sits upon Helbrecht's backpack is a constant, physical reminder of that oath. He carries it with him into every battle, a macabre talisman that he believes will one day guide him to his quarry. It is an intensely personal detail, the kind of thing that reveals the human being beneath the title and the armor and the weight of 10,000 years of legacy. Helbrecht is not an abstract symbol of the chapter's ideals, as he is a man, a warrior, a believer, and every decision he makes, every order he gives, every battle he fights, is driven by the same burning faith that drove Sigismund to stand vigil at the Cadian Gate for 500 years. And so, we arrive at the present, or rather, at the eternal present in which the Black Templars perpetually exist, because for the sons of Sigismund, there is no past and no future. There is only the crusade, only the next battle, only the next enemy to be found and destroyed in the Emperor's name. The Eternal Crusader still sails the void, that massive Gloriana-class battleship that has served as the chapter's spiritual home since the days of Sigismund himself. It has been expanded and refitted countless times over the millennia, and growing larger and more formidable with each passing century, until it can now hold twice as many warriors as a standard battle barge. Its corridors are lined with chapels and reliquaries, its armories stocked with weapons that have been blessed by centuries of prayer, its hull scarred by 10,000 years of continuous warfare. It is not merely a warship. It is a cathedral that happens to carry enough firepower to level a continent. Aboard the Eternal Crusader and scattered across the fleet of crusade vessels that comprise the Black Templars' mobile domain, thousands of warriors in black armor prepare for battles that have not yet been fought against enemies that have not yet been identified. In the meditation chambers, neophytes kneel before their initiate mentors and learn the catechisms of the chapter. In the training halls, and sword brethren test their blades against each other in duels that push both participants to the very limits of their enhanced physiology. In the Chapel of the Black Sword, the weapon that Sigismund himself carried into his last battle rests in a stasis casket, waiting for the day when another emperor's champion will be called to wield it. High Marshal Helbrecht, who has now crossed the Rubicon Primaris and been reborn in a larger, more powerful body while keeping his old armor reforged to fit his new frame, continues to lead the chapter with the combination of strategic brilliance and religious fervor that has defined every High Marshal since Sigismund. He carries a curious relic on his backpack, the skull of the navigator who first guided him to Armageddon. Yet he keeps it with him in the hope that its presence will eventually guide him to Gazkul Thraka, so that he may fulfill his oath and avenge those who fell during the Third War. It is a small detail, but it reveals the deeply personal nature of the Black Templars' faith. Their crusade is not abstract, it is not theoretical, it is made up of specific oaths sworn to specific brothers, specific enemies who must be found and destroyed, specific relics that carry the weight of centuries of devotion. And Grimaldus, the hero of Hellsreach, has also crossed the Rubicon Primaris. The chaplain who crawled from the rubble of the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, carrying the last relics of a holy place, who has since been elevated to the rank of High Chaplain, continues to serve as one of the chapter's most inspiring and feared leaders. As his Cenobite servitors, the failed aspirants of the chapter who have been repurposed to carry the sacred relics into battle, march behind him in a solemn procession that looks less like a military formation and more like a religious parade. One of those servitors carries a chunk of the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant itself, a piece of the very building that collapsed on top of Grimaldus and failed to kill him. It is a statement, a challenge, a reminder that the Black Templars do not break, no matter what is piled on top of them. Across the galaxy, crusade fleets bearing the Black Cross hunt the enemies of the Emperor in every sector and every system where threats can be found. Some crusades are small, a handful of warriors aboard a single strike cruiser, responding to a distress call or prosecuting a vendetta against a specific enemy. And others are vast, hundreds or even thousands of warriors supported by armored columns and Titan detachments, grinding their way through enemy territory with the inexorable force of a glacier. And somewhere out in the void, new crusades are being launched even as we speak, because the oath has not been fulfilled, the enemies have not been destroyed, and the crusade goes on. The Black Templars do not negotiate. They do not compromise. They do not make treaties with the enemies of the Emperor or extend mercy to those who have turned from his light. They are the burning sword of the imperial faith, the iron fist of human devotion, and they will not stop, will not rest, will not falter until every last enemy of the God Emperor has been crushed beneath their boots and the galaxy has been scoured clean of the heretic, the alien, and the witch. That is their oath, that is their purpose, that is their crusade, and it has been burning for 10,000 years, and it will burn for 10,000 more, and 10,000 after that, until the stars themselves go dark, and there is nothing left but the cold void and the echoing memory of warriors who refused, absolutely and completely refused, to stop fighting. This has been the story of the Black Templars, the Sons of Dawn, the heirs of Sigismund, the Eternal Crusaders, And if their story has moved you, if it has stirred something in your blood and made you feel the weight of an oath that spans 10 millennia, then consider this your call to join the crusade. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell so you never miss another journey into the darkest, deepest, most fascinating corners of this universe we love. And if you have a chapter or a character or a conflict that you want me to cover next, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and your suggestions fuel the fire that keeps this channel burning. No pity, no remorse, no fear. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also faith. And faith, as the Black Templars have proven time and again, is the most powerful weapon in the Emperor's arsenal. The crusade continues.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.